Okay, can you go to Citizen U and just try it? It should be up live. Should see the electron map. Once it loads, it should load there. Hit play. Hit the play button.
Video is unavailable.
Sure.
They got a screen.
Why isn't it playing? Refresh it. I don't know. We've got viewers on there, but there we go.
Oh, perfect. There you go. What'd you do?
Don't know.
Oh, perfect. What'd you do?
Hello, everybody. Welcome to citizenu.org. And it's that time again. It's time for CRAM for your AP exam.
Oh, how about
Hello, everybody. Welcome to citizenu.org. We're here to help you review. If you have questions, email us, Mr. Andy, or text or Twitter? Where are we meeting our questions?
It looks like the best place for questions tonight is going to be on Twitter at hashtag CRAM4, the number 4 exam, or hashtag CRAM4APExam. Either one of those hashtags we'll be checking out. And we'll let you know when we get some questions. We did have one question earlier.
Right, before you start, can we just do a little warm-up? I mean, whoo, this is a big thing tomorrow, a big deal. Not only is college credit at stake, but listen, our future is at stake. We really anticipate that you out there preparing for this test are doing more than just preparing for a test. You're beginning in a lifelong journey, a lifestyle that sustains our democracy. So let's just do a little warm-up. Let's warm up with the big 10 words. Shall we join with us if you like? I will go slow. Foundations, federalism. Public opinion, participation, political parties, interest groups, campaigns and elections, Congress, president, courts. Those are the big 10. Review those. I know some of you said, not again. Okay, I will. Foundations, federalism, public opinion, participation, political parties, interest groups, campaigns and elections, Congress, president, and courts.
My goodness.
Just a little warm up. The test tomorrow will be all about those 10 topics. I would write those 10 topics down on the sleeve, not on my shirt sleeve, but on the sleeve of the FRQ form, and remind myself for every FRQ to write at least about 3 of those topics.
Hey, if any of you have Mr. Volpert in class, please make sure you let him know that we appreciate his support on Twitter, and to make sure you get those 5 bonus points. And Julian Crosby, you'll be fine. We have a lot of time before the test. Let us know what your questions are, and we'd love to help answer your questions.
When I think of foundations, the first thing that comes to my mind is the Shays Rebellion. What? A little history on this test? The Shays Rebellion reminded the founders that the Articles of Confederation was ineffective. Remember, the big question of this lifestyle that we live in is, where should our government power be? Should it be in the central government? And if so, how much power? Under the Articles of Confederation, much of that power was still seated, rooted in the state governments. It was ineffective and inefficient. We needed a stronger central government to regulate our commerce, to keep us safe with an army, to do all those things that we expect, deliver our mail, build roads, canals.
Hey, we have a question from Nathaniel. Can you go over the sections of government? I think by that, Nathaniel, you're asking about the institutions of government. If you see that word institutions tomorrow,
big word.
Remember, you're looking at particularly the 3 branches of government, the idea of the legislative branch or Congress writing the laws, the idea that the executive branch or the president, who's the chief executive, is enforcing the laws. So if Congress writes a tax law, it's up to the president to delegate someone to be the Secretary of the Treasury. And the Secretary of the Treasury puts the IRS in charge of collecting taxes to enforce tax laws. And of course, if there's some kind of question about whether a law is unconstitutional, the institution that interprets laws is the judicial branch.
Marbury versus Madison.
And particularly the U.S. Supreme Court.
One of those funny sounding words that I think will appear on the test tomorrow, make sure you get it right, is linkage institution. So this course is about the government on one side and we the people on the other. So how do we connect we the people with the government? We call this a linkage institution. Well, what are they? Linkage institutions include political parties, interest groups, media, campaigns and elections. All of these institutions link you and I, we the people, to the government. Which ones are stronger and which ones are weaker? Well, I would clearly say that interest groups have grown the strongest. Interest groups, because of all the access points of federalism. There are many places in our government, national, state, and local, even our school districts, where interest groups can come in to try to influence policy. Interestingly enough, political parties, I think, are weaker. Political parties have grown weak because of campaign finance laws. Political parties are weaker because they have less of a role in the nomination of candidates. So political parties, which used to be an incredibly strong linkage institution, aren't as strong as they used to be.
Hey, just a reminder that, oh, is that backwards? Oh my gosh.
No.
Is it? No?
No.
If you have questions, hashtag, use Twitter, hashtag CRAM4APExam or hashtag CRAM4APExam. We have a great shout out to some of those great teachers. Mrs. Cassie Buys. Can you please explain, this comes from Callum Carr. Can you please explain some ways in which interest groups attempt to influence policy? What are some lobbying techniques, Mr. Larson?
I love talking about interest group techniques because we have a lot of political science data on this. We're not guessing, we're not speculating. We know that the single most important and effective technique is when interest groups simply inform members of the government, inform members of Congress, inform the president or his staff, inform local state government officials. One thing that we're oftentimes confused about, well, don't interest groups like start riots and protest? You know, it's really not that effective. What's effective is being a little bit more low key, but giving information, testifying in front of Congress. Those are some of the techniques that are the most important. They don't typically endorse candidates. Remember, interest groups are not about winning elections. They're about winning issues. And so if I endorse a candidate and that candidate loses, I've lost my access.
Hey, Eleanor asks, what's the difference between monetary and fiscal policy? Great question. So monetary policy is made when the president appoints members to the Federal Reserve Board. The Federal Reserve Board is our central bank. They make decisions about interest rates or what the value of money is going to be. That's monetary policy. Inflation, interest rates, the value of money. Fiscal policy are the annual budget choices that government makes. So it's the idea that Congress has the power of the purse. Congress can raise taxes, cut taxes. Congress appropriates or spends money. That's fiscal policy. So the Congress writing the budget, the president approving the budget, that's all fiscal policy. Eleanor also asks about how agencies work. So the executive branch, similar to what we were saying before, if Congress writes a law about keeping food safe, it's up to an agency like the Food and Drug Administration or the Environmental Protection Agency on an environmental piece of legislation to enforce that law.
Remember, you're watching AP CRAM4APExam. We're the two teachers, and we're here to make the complex simple and the confusing clear. Text your friends. We're going to be on for another hour or so answering your last-minute questions. We hope that you do your best tomorrow. And remember, you'll do your best if you know what to expect.
Logan asked for a shout-out from Mr. DeBoard, and he has another question about bureaucracy. It seems like during this program, so many questions about the bureaucracy because it's complicated. The bureaucracy is part of the executive branch. It administers the law. One question we've seen on FRQs the last couple of years is that word bureaucratic discretion. And this is the idea that when Congress writes a law, a complicated law, it gives a particular bureaucracy power or discretion to be able to enforce that law and sometimes to adjudicate that law.
Ooh, that's a tough word.
Right, that the bureaucracy can sometimes punish a company or a corporation that's violating that law, almost like a court.
Remember, there'll be 60 multiple choice questions tomorrow, and you have 45 minutes. Answer them all. Guess if you need to. Don't panic when you miss a few or some. You can miss actually quite a lot and feel pretty good about yourself tomorrow. This is tough. No one's going to get a perfect, and many of us, all of us, are going to miss a healthy number. So don't panic, but read the question carefully. Make sure you read the difference between an electoral mandate and a federal mandate. Totally different. An electoral mandate is when I win an election and I feel I can deliver my promises. A federal mandate is when the national government requires states to do something.
Caitlin, thank you for your question about bureaucratic discretion. I think I read your mind. Thank you, Ms. Calso. And Ms. Keisha asks about party eras. Good question. I don't think you have to know about party eras, but some of the more complicated party questions you might get would be about critical elections or realignment. And this is the idea that's similar to 1932 with FDR and the New Deal, where we saw a large realignment of people who used to vote Republican, most notably African Americans, started voting for the Democratic Party in the 1930s. So that would be an example of a critical election. The other word sometimes that comes up with parties is party machine. Yeah. This is the idea of a local one-party dominant system. We teach in the suburbs of Chicago. Chicago is known as a Democratic Party machine where only Democrats get elected in Chicago. And oftentimes they're trading government jobs or government contracts for political support, which is corrupt. And that's what party machines are known for, like Tammany Hall, corrupt.
When I think of political parties, I think about unified and divided government. Know that difference. Unified government is when the president and the Congress are run by the same political party. We currently have a unified government. Our president, Donald Trump, is a Republican. Our Congress, both House and Senate, are run by majority Republicans. If it's not unified, it's called divided. So if our Congress had a majority of Democrats right now, which they may in a couple of years after the midterm elections, we call that a divided government. Political parties, unified and divided government.
Hey, Sierra has a huge shout out for Mrs. Murat for having a 3-hour cram session night. Thanks, Mrs. Murat. Your kids are going to do great. And then Marie asks about executive agreements. How timely, Marie? Because all the news is about executive agreements, particularly that executive agreement that President Obama made with Iran's president. So executive agreements are made by the American president with another foreign leader. They're similar to a treaty, but they don't need to be approved by the U.S. Senate. So they're actually much faster to get accomplished. However, as we saw yesterday when President Trump essentially broke the United States' involvement in the Iran nuclear deal, one of the downfalls of executive agreements is that the next president or a future president can always break that executive agreement. So read about that in the news, and you'll know a lot more about executive agreements.
It reminds us of the difference between formal and informal powers. The Constitution gave the Congress many formal powers. The Congress was intended to do a significant number of functions. The president, on the other hand, not very important in the original Constitution. In fact, some thought they made the president merely a clerk of some sorts. But due to the president's informal powers, the president today has grown substantially to the point where the institution, regardless of who the president is, the institution makes every president extremely powerful. Some of those informal powers are the use of the bully pulpit, the ability to use the media to build public opinion. Donald Trump tweets every morning to create an agenda for that day. Makes him incredibly powerful.
Hey,
also executive agreements, executive orders, executive privilege.
Carla gives a shout out to Mrs. Cherry.
Yes.
And Carla wants to know about Federalist 10 and factions. And remember that James Madison wrote Federalist 10. They knew factions were bad, but factions are human nature. We have cliques all the time. But Madison envisioned to have these large republics or large states that where we elect representative officials. And when you have a large population, there's no majority faction. Those different cliques and different factions have to form alliances. And so Madison envisioned having these large republics that were able to balance these factions against each other.
Pluralism.
Pluralism to prevent one majority faction from taking over, because the fear is that one majority faction can become a tyranny, that it can be oppressive to the minority. So great question, Carl.
This reminds me that in the original Constitution, no mention of political parties, but America today is unthinkable without political parties. So despite the fact that the Constitution didn't have political parties mentioned, even in the earliest stages of ratification, the Federalist Papers, the two political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, were already beginning to show their stripes.
Hey, we have some questions on FRQ tips. Some of our FRQ tips that we tell our students, sorry, I'm writing something down, is to certainly use a lot of space, write as much as you can, use the prompt vocabulary, repeat the words of the prompt in your answers. And then our strategy, we tell our students to label the letters to help create an organized essay. And then, so if you have your letters, A, B, C, simply cross out the letters before you hand in that FRQ. And that way you get the best of both worlds. So I know there's a lot of mixed stories about what you should or shouldn't do. If you simply cross out, don't cross out your answer, that's bad. But if you simply cross out the individual labeling letter, there's no risk and you'll do fine.
So let's review that. Repeat the vocabulary from the prompt, space appropriately, and get rid of those pronouns. No he's, theys, its, and thems. And please don't write the word government in your FRQ. Make it national government, state government, local government. If you use the word federal government, you're talking about the national government.
Yeah. And don't say it if you mean Congress. Don't write they if you mean Supreme Court justices. Avoid those pronouns.
Write more. You'll have plenty of time. Remember, there's no real penalty for wrong information. So just drain it into your FRQ. Write as much as you can on everything that you're writing. But if it has, say, pick one of these two, I would write on both, but write a lot on both.
Hey, thanks for those shout outs. Thanks for those questions to hashtag CRAM4APExam and hashtag CRAM4APExam. Julia wants to give a shout out to Mr. Franz, third period AP Gov, man. And she wants to know the difference between earmarks, pork barrel, and casework. These are all great words associated with the legislative branch, with Congress. Remember, earmarks and pork barrel, they are synonyms. They're the idea of local projects that are attached to a larger budget bill, and they help give a local member of Congress a reputation for serving their constituents.
Used to be quite common.
It used to be quite common, and incumbents could get more pork barrels for their local districts, which gave incumbents an advantage. The other incumbent advantage is casework, and a synonym for casework is constituent service. And this is the idea that a member of Congress or their staff in the office, if a local constituent or voter has a need, like grandma lost a Social Security check, the family can call the member of Congress or the staff, and that staff will help locate that Social Security payment. If we have students out there who are going to a military service academy, you know about constituent service. It's that application process to get in the West Point or the U.S. Naval Academy. Those are also examples of casework.
Well, that reminds me of the three primary functions of Congress. Remember, on the test tomorrow in the FRQ, state the obvious. Congress writes laws, but they also do oversight, check and balance the other branches, and they check and balance itself, Congress. Write laws, oversight, constituent service. Those are the three primary functions of our legislative branch in the United States government.
Hey, a shout out to Mr. Perez from Chris. Tell Chris what an issue network is.
Issue network. Now, this is where our political scientists might have a beef with the two teachers. Issue networks are slightly different than a iron triangle, but let's just go through them. An iron triangle is
Start with issue networks.
Issue networks, like iron triangles, are the means by which political scientists try to explain the policy-making process. How does law get made? How do policies get passed? Issue networks would mean a variety of groups, a variety of interest groups play a role in influencing Congress and influencing the president in the writing and enforcement of public policy. An iron triangle is a little bit more specific, where you have a congressional committee, an executive agency, and an interest group that are working on a very narrow policy, kind of like mushrooms.
So safe food, laws about safe food are examples of iron triangles because they get so technical. And the idea of, we have this law that Congress writes, the Safe Food and Drug Act, and then they give discretion, bureaucratic discretion, to the Food and Drug Administration to come up with really, really detailed policies, like how many different types of sliced mushrooms are considered canned mushrooms. And those decisions about how to come up with the 6 different types of canned mushrooms, sliced, whole, button,
Button
mushrooms. The stems have to be 5 millimeters long, and pieces and slices. Those types of canned mushroom decisions.
What's the difference between a piece and a slice?
Pieces and stems, sorry.
Yeah.
Those decisions are made.
I'd like a stem of pizza, please.
Those decisions are made by a bureaucrat in the Food and Drug Administration.
Wait, what's a bureaucrat?
Someone from the executive branch.
An employee of government.
A civil servant from the executive branch.
Not always civil.
Who is enforcing the law, meeting with a member of Congress or a staff member of Congress, the legislative branch. And they also meet with an expert in canned foods or food safety or mushrooms, who's a lobbyist from a special interest group. So and the reason why they call it iron triangle is no one cares about these details. These are details that are meaningless, but there are very few people making that decisions. These are the elites making a decision. It's a very fast decision. There's no debate about this. There's no conflict. Issue networks are very controversial. takes a long time to get policy through an issue network. Iron triangles are not controversial. They're boring, they're dull, and it takes really quick time to pass policies.
Don't be intimidated by this term policy making. We know Congress is a policymaker. The executive branch through the president and the cabinet and bureaucratic discretion are policymakers. But don't forget that the Supreme Court now is a policymaker, that the Supreme Court has decided, you know, we're going to make the decision on same-sex marriage. We're going to make the decision on guns. We're going to make a decision on immigration. We're not going to defer to the executive branch. We're not going to defer to the legislative branch. The Supreme Court of the United States is now a policy-making body. They've entered into the political thicket.
All right. Clearly, we have some students who are creating Twitters just for tonight. Thank you. So not ready for the exam. That's the Twitter feed. Wants to give a shout out to Ms. Burrows and Mr. Lampert and would like you to explain the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Well, when we talk about the U.S. Constitution, we talk about changes that were made to remedy the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation created a really weak central government. Couldn't regulate commerce, couldn't keep our borders safe, couldn't raise money to pass out benefits to the needy. So the Constitution was written. One of the first things that they did is they added an interstate commerce clause. This enumerated power, this formal power, allows for Congress to regulate economic activity. So when a cattle farmer, a rancher from Texas is selling his beef to the meatpacking plant in Chicago, the Congress can write laws that regulate the transfer of that beef. They can regulate how the beef are slaughtered, how hot dogs are made. This is interstate commerce. It has been used more than any other clause in the Constitution to empower the national government. In fact, the story of American government is the story of the aggrandizement, the increasing size and power of the national government.
All right. David, oh, yeah, one of our favorite civics teachers, Mr. Pelican, a shout out. David wants to know, which Federalist papers should they be familiar with tomorrow?
10. Federalist 10.
Federalist 10 is important. Federalist
51.
51 sets up
checks
the discussion about checks and balances. So those are two of the big ones. Good question, David.
Great question.
John also wants to give a shout out to his Gov teacher, Mr. Miller.
Love Mr. Miller.
And wants to know about the House Ways and Means Committee. The House Ways and Means Committee, one of the most important committees on Capitol Hill, because Congress has the power of the purse. Congress has the power to raise taxes and get revenues, and Congress has the power to spend that money. Spending that money is called appropriations. But taxing that money, where you're going to get your revenues from, that has to start, those bills have to start in the House of Representatives according to the Constitution. And in the House Ways and Means Committee is that committee in the House that initially deals with tax laws.
Make sure to know the difference between a standing committee and a conference committee. A standing committee would be the permanent committees in the House and the Senate. They're there every year and every year and every year. House Ways and Means Committee, House Agricultural Committee, Senate Judiciary Committee. They're standing. We hope that they foster expertise. A conference committee is when a bill is passed out of the House and the bill is passed out of the Senate, but they're different. They have to be reconciled. Remember, before the president can sign or veto, that bill has to be exact from both the House and the Senate. If you reconcile those differences between the House and the Senate, we call this a conference committee.
Hey, Dylan has a shout out to Mr. Boggess, and he'd like to know more about bully pulpits. Tell him about bully pulpits.
Well, this is another example of an informal power of the President of the United States. One of the greatest powers, according to Richard Neubauer, the great political scientist, he argued, Neubauer. He argued that presidents have the informal power to persuade us, the public, to negotiate with Congress, to interact with interest groups, using the media, using the bully pulpit, using the ability to shout it loud and get noticed. Members of Congress don't have that. If your local congressman said, I want to make a big splash and introduce a big bill, No one's paying attention. But Donald Trump just puts a tweet out in the morning, and all of a sudden it's front page news. We talk about it for the rest of the day. He uses his bully pulpit to control the policy-making agenda. He's an agenda setter.
And we have a Twitter trend on campaign finance, Dan, from Yareth, Audrey, Haley, and Jade. They all want to know about campaign finance. We have some shout outs to Mrs. Chase from West Bloomfield. We have a shout out to Mr. Kirchberg. And what are 4 things we should know about campaign finance?
Boy, I would know at least these 4 things about campaign finance. Know the difference between hard money and soft money. Hard money goes directly to the candidates. Soft money cannot go to the candidates. Hard money is regulated. Soft money is not regulated. So I can only give $2,700 to Mr. Canine when he runs for president. However, you can give me unlimited amounts of money, and I'll run ads over on the side. I'll pay for people to call to make sure they vote for Mr. Canine. I will pay people to knock on doors to get people to vote for Canine. As long as I don't work for or with Mr. Canine, I can raise unlimited amounts of money because I'm a super PAC, and my super PAC's called Canine.
Right. Very good. We also, did you do 4 there? Was that 4?
That was 1.
Oh my gosh. All right.
Another thing.
Super.
Buckley versus Vallejo. Make sure the Supreme Court plays a role in this. The Supreme Court has said that your campaign donations are protected by the First Amendment. Free speech isn't just what I say, it's symbolic by the money that I give.
Seems like a common theme. And again, we have Amanda's writing about this, Natalia, Arjani. They're asking about the difference between PACs and super PACs. And a lot of people are throwing out the 527s. So 527s and super PACs are essentially synonyms. Those are independent expenditure groups.
It's the difference between Superman and man.
Okay, that's distracting. 527s and super PACs are independent expenditure groups that can get money, an unlimited amount of money, especially from rich people, fat cats, or corporations. And that's where the Citizens United case comes in, where corporations can give an unlimited amount of money to super PACs, but that has to go to independent expenditure groups. It cannot go directly to Hillary Clinton's campaign. It cannot go directly to Donald Trump's campaign. PACs, just good old-fashioned political action committees, raise and spend hard money, which Mr. Larson was just talking about. PACs, which the National Rifle Association has, or the National Restaurant Association, whatever NRA you prefer.
More mushrooms.
They have regular old special interest groups, or PACs, that can raise or spend. That money can go directly to candidates, but it's limited in about $5,000 increments.
Superman is unlimited. Man is limited. Super PACs, unlimited. PACs, limited.
Shout out to Mr. Coggins. Amicus curiae briefs.
Oh, I love Amicus curiae briefs. This is that Latin phrase that means friend of the court. Let's say I'm a leading expert on immigration, and I know that the Supreme Court this year is hearing a case on immigration. They're looking at Donald Trump's travel ban. I'm an expert on this. I write an essay. I write a brief, and I send it to the Supreme Court, and I say, you should read this. I think you'll be influenced by it. When an outsider who's not involved in a particular case tries to influence the outcome of the Supreme Court, we call this an amicus curiae brief. There are other Latin phrases, though, I think you should know. Make sure you know stare decisis. Stare decisis means let the decision stand. Our Supreme Court and our entire federal judiciary tries to base its decisions on previous court decisions. Stare decisis.
We have about 1/2 hour left. You've asked great questions. We're going to give more shout outs and answer as many questions as we can get in a half an hour. Hannah asks us to shout out to Mr. Courier and wants to know about the most important Supreme Court cases. I'll start with 2 of my favorite, Brown versus the Board of Education, which is where the Supreme Court used the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause to overturn that case of Plessy versus Ferguson. Remember, in Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court said that public schools could not have legal de jure racial segregation. So Brown versus the Board of Education. One of my other favorites that involves a 14th Amendment case is Gideon versus Wainwright. And this is where we get the term selective incorporation. So Gideon versus Wainwright gives individuals civil liberties to their right to an attorney, their right to counsel.
In all 50 states.
In all 50 states.
1960s.
That was not an individual right at the state level of government or the county level of government until the case of Gideon versus Wainwright in the 1960s.
Unanimous.
So that's where the Sixth Amendment right to an attorney was incorporated, meaning that the 14th Amendment's due process clause was interpreted by the Supreme Court to make state, local, county courts provide the right to an attorney to any accused criminal who is facing a potential jail. So those are two of my favorite cases.
Say, text your friends. You're on citizenu.org, and this is free. No money involved here. We're not exchanging cash for this. It's a free review. If you've got friends out there who have questions, now's their time. Jump on citizenu.org. On Twitter, hashtag CRAM4APExam. CRAM4APExam. We're the two teachers. We'll be here for about another half hour, helping you prepare for tomorrow's AP American Government Politics.
And Hannah, I think we just explained a little bit of the 14th Amendment, but we'll still give a shout out to Mrs. Legg and a shout out to Mrs. Kelly, who's asking about, well, her students, Emmanuel's asking about gerrymandering.
Listen, can we just add a couple more Supreme Court cases before we forget the question?
Sure.
You said Brown v. Board and Gideon. I'd like to add into that mix Marbury versus Madison and McCulloch v. Maryland and Roe v. Wade. Marbury versus Madison is judicial review. The Supreme Court rules on the constitutionality of the actions of government. McCulloch v. Maryland deals with national supremacy. The issue at hand in 1819 was the national bank. States said the Constitution doesn't provide for a national bank, and so the state of Maryland wanted to tax it and regulate it. And the national government said, using the necessary and proper clause, the bank is legit. So the national supremacy to write a law that the states can't mess with. And Roe v. Wade is all about privacy. Remember, privacy is not mentioned in the Constitution, so the Supreme Court is a policy-making body. Writes an opinion called Roe v. Wade in 1973, legalizing abortion, legalizing privacy.
I feel like we get this question every year from Mr. Alan Woot's question about our FRQ predictions. My FRQ prediction is you'll have at least one FRQ about checks and balances. Please, please, before you walk into the exam room tomorrow morning, go through a list of what those checks and balances are. Things like Congress writes the law, but the president's able to sign or veto law. That we have a Supreme Court that can rule laws unconstitutional, but you should know that the president has the power to appoint justices to the Supreme Court, and that the U.S. Senate has the power to confirm those justices. So really go through your checks and balances, and you will for sure be prepared for at least one of those FRQs.
I rarely predict, but this year I feel so strongly. In fact, I made notes of 10 things that I'm absolutely sure will be on the FRQs. Foundations, federalism, public opinion, participation, political parties, interest groups, campaigns and elections, Congress, president, courts. I guarantee you those 10 will be on the FRQ.
Go Mount Hebron from Sally with a shout out from Mr. Duke. Can you explain congressional oversight?
Yeah, so Congress has three primary functions: write laws, constituent service, and oversight. They're given, the Congress of the United States is given enumerated powers to investigate the executive branch, to investigate bureaucratic agencies, to make sure that the money that they've appropriated is spent correctly. In some cases, to give oversight of themselves. How is Congress behaving? They might look into ethical behavior of other members of Congress. This is congressional oversight. It's checks and balances. Say, before somebody said a question about gerrymandering, make sure to know the difference between the U.S. Census, reapportionment, redistricting, and gerrymandering, all important into House congressional districts. Every 10 years, the U.S. Constitution mandates a census. Count the population, because the House of Representatives is determined. The representation is determined by population. If your state is losing relative population, you're losing relative representation in Congress. And so every 10 years, you might have one less or one more congressional district. To reallocate to each state how many representatives they receive, we call that reapportionment. Then they have to redraw the lines. Who's the they? The state legislatures redraw those congressional district lines. That's called redistricting. If redistricting is done in a very skullduggery means, if they do it in a deceitful way to advantage incumbents or to punish the opposing political party, if the district lines are drawn, the lights went out in the building. We call this gerrymandering. Lights back on. Oh boy, power to the people. Say thank you for watching. We were still answering your questions. Remember, there are 4 FRQs. You have 100 minutes.
We have a shout out to Coach Stockel, and let's explain single member districts. Great question.
Oh, so important.
Single member district, you'll see that term, or you'll see a synonym of winner takes all. These are rules and election systems that create a two-party system.
Two-party system.
And it works exactly like sports. If you have one trophy, or if you have only one member in the election can win that seat in Congress, it tends to promote a system where you have 2 parties who are competing for that championship. So that single-member district, winner takes all, it promotes a two-party system.
Two-party system. Now, that doesn't mean third parties don't exist.
Third parties exist, and they often
can't win.
They can't win, but a lot of times third parties will advocate for issues that are later adopted. We've seen this with women's suffrage. We've seen this with ending child labor. We've seen this with the legalization of marijuana, policies that were initially advocated by third party. We have a shout out to Mrs. McHugh, second period. Why is front loading common? What's notable about front loading?
This is a campaign election question, and it's about the presidential nominating process. Remember, to become president, you really have to win twice. You have to win your party's nomination, and you also have to win the general election, the voters. Well, how do you win the nomination? The nomination takes place in a state by state. All 50 states participate in a circus of sorts where all 50 states hold either caucuses or primaries to pick their state favorite nominee. So Donald Trump and that whole host, that cattle show of Republican candidates back in 2016, or Hillary and Bernie and the Democratic side, traveled state to state to state, winning votes in primaries, winning delegates to go to the national conventions to choose them as their nominee. The earliest states have a disproportionate role in creating a bandwagon effect. So Iowa caucus is first, the New Hampshire primary is first, and we call these front-loaded. States want to be as early as possible so they can kind of be that disproportionate player in determining who our presidential nominees are. We call this front-loading.
Hey, Rachel has a shout out to Mrs. Scana in her third block. And she wants to know about examples from foundations. So foundations usually is unit 1 in most AP government classes. I love the word from foundations, that word republic.
Yes.
And the idea that the United States isn't necessarily a democracy, but we are a republic where we elect officials to the House of Representatives and to the Senate, thanks to the 17th Amendment. And we elect those officials to office, and then they make policy. They write the laws. So we're a republic. That contrasts, there's a number of questions about referendum and state or local referendum.
Very good.
We know that a lot of states, particularly states like California, Colorado, they put a lot of voter choices into voters' hands through referendum and ballot initiatives. And this is the idea that local voters or throughout the whole state can decide on issues from whether to raise taxes for public schools, whether to legalize medical marijuana. These are policy issues that in some states and local governments, they put those decisions into the voters' hands. And that's not a republic. That would be a direct democracy where the people have a direct say in policymaking. So that's where you could see some foundations issues.
When I think of foundations, I like to look at how the founders created our institutions. Only the House of Representatives was directly elected in the beginning. The president indirectly elected. The U.S. senators were appointed at the state level, and the Supreme Court was appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. 4 of our institutions, only 1 was selected directly by the people, even though the Constitution started with the words, "we the people." It gives us that really critical argument between pluralism and elitism. The founding fathers, elites in and of themselves, activists, highly educated, wealthy. They really didn't trust the common man, so they didn't put a lot of power in the hands of the common man. But they did give them the direct election of the House and gave the revenue bills into the House, which means in the end, you and I make the most ultimate decision. What's the government going to do with our money?
Alexis, I'll give a shout out to Mr. Coggins, who was a great AP government teacher. I don't think you're going to have to know about supply or demands, supply side economics. In terms of budget making, that is something that you should know. That yes. Budget making is the same process that we pass a law. We have this law called the Budget Reform Act of 1974 that created the modern day standard for the process of budget making. The president recommends a budget. He has a White House office known as the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, that prepares the budget for each president every year. They recommend that budget to Congress. Congress writes the budget as they write any law. And then the president either vetoes that budget bill or he can sign that budget bill. That is the budget process. Another couple of words you should know about the budget are mandatory spending or entitlement programs like Social Security, which are permanent spending programs. And those contrast with discretionary spending programs. Discretionary spending means that Congress has an annual choice over how much to give our space program for NASA, or how much to give to public education, or discretionary spending for how much to spend on roads. So that's where you get discretionary spending. All right. And boy, a lot of questions on different types of resolutions. I've never seen a question on different types of.
Do you want to play a game? I'm going to put a term up on the board here. First person to tweet in their answer gets a big shout out. So here's your word: franking. So someone tweet out hashtag CRAM4APExam or CRAM4APExam. We'll be looking for someone to define the word franking, and you'll get a big shout out.
Meanwhile, while Mr. Larson looks through your tweets to see who wins that, Casey Barker has a shout out to Mrs. Beverly's 5th period class. She wants to know the difference between civil rights and civil liberties. Civil
rights and civil liberties set up by the promissory note in our Declaration of Independence when Thomas J., the DJ, said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal with certain inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." The Declaration of Independence promised both civil liberties and equality. Well, this became a problem in the original Constitution because what do these words actually mean? And in fact, we really don't see them codified until the 14th Amendment, where we have the Due Process Clause and the Equal Protection Clause. Now, to interpret how the national government is going to enforce in all 50 states civil liberties for all and civil rights for all. Civil liberties deal with those individual rights like free speech, the right to an attorney, the right to due process. This is primarily found in our Bill of Rights. Civil liberties, your rights and mine. Equal protection, civil rights, deals with group rights. All African Americans should be treated the same as everyone else, Latinos, women, those who are gay and lesbian. Equal rights, civil rights. 14th Amendment, one of my favorite amendments. In fact, what other amendments might we need to know? First Amendment, 10th Amendment. 15th, 19th, 26th. I would say at least those.
Hey, I think we have a tie on the franking contest. Amon talks about franking as an incumbency advantage. You're absolutely right.
Great, great.
And Rye, Big Brothers Burns, identify or describes franking as free office mailing for congressmen.
Fantastic, fantastic. Franking is free mail given to members of Congress, and it is an incumbency advantage.
We have a shout out to Mrs. Sosa and some Enlightenment questions. I don't know, typically you don't have to know Hobbes or Montesquieu. Locke is sometimes on a test for AP government because Locke's ideas from the Enlightenment and the social contract are the basis of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. So that idea that human beings can rise up against the government if the government's not protecting natural rights, something that we certainly saw Thomas Jefferson write about in the Declaration of Independence, Those ideas come from John Locke. So thank you, Mrs. Sosa student Naomi.
We still get a lot of questions about the bureaucracy. And can we just say the essentials of the bureaucracy are, don't be intimidated by the word, bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy is the arm and the leg of the president, the arm and the leg of the executive branch. When the Congress passes a law, someone needs to enforce it. So let's say Congress says the hamburger you had tonight at McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, wherever you went, in and out, the meat has to be a certain quality. It has to be healthy. They passed the law. Healthy hamburgers. Well, who enforces that? Donald Trump? He's not going in and out. Well, he might be going to In-N-Out Burger, but he doesn't have the time to go to every one. So he creates the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. They hire agents to go all over the country to investigate to make sure that hamburgers are healthy. The bureaucracy is the arm and the leg of the executive branch. But what makes the bureaucracy so troubling to some is that those agents who go out to regulate hamburgers, they might punish those hamburger joints. So they actually serve like judges. They also might restate the policy. Well, the hamburger must be in a cardboard container instead of a plastic container. So they're actually adding to the laws that Congress passed. So bureaucrats become, the FDA becomes not only a lawmaker, not only enforcer, but also an adjudicator, someone who actually passes out penalties. 3 branches, no check and balance, all within the bureaucracy.
Hey, thank you to Isaac out there listening. Thank you to Ethan and his shout outs to Mrs. Gibson at Tallwood High School. And thank you, a shout out to Mrs. Williams from Sophia, and a shout out from Maddie Cash Money, shouting out to Mrs. Ramel from Goshen. And, a shout out from Talia, who wants to know, Mr. Larson, what is your favorite Supreme Court case that you have not mentioned?
Well, I'm just picking up my little coffee cup here with my Supreme Court cases. I always bring this into my AP exam. I'm not sure they'll let you, but I've already talked about Brown. We've talked about Gideon. We've talked about Marbury. We've talked about McCullough. We've talked about Roe v. Wade. My absolute favorite case is Gitlau versus New York. Gitlau versus New York was the first selective incorporation case. It's when the Supreme Court, for the first time, took the First Amendment's free speech clause and applied them to all the states using the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. 3 cheers for Gitlau versus New York.
Hey, a shout out from Owen to Mrs. Battaglia. Great question. A lot of you have had the difference between enumerated powers
so important,
and unenumerated powers.
So important.
So remember, the Constitution gives specific powers to the legislative branch, to Congress. Those specific powers are numbered. Those are called enumerated powers. We also call those express powers given to Congress. The most important one being, well, Congress has the power to declare war, but really the most important one to expand the power of national government is the Interstate Commerce Clause, particularly when that enumerated power is connected with Clause 18 of that section of the Constitution, the Elastic Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which gives flexibility. We also know that the Constitution gives formal powers to the president, things like the power of commander-in-chief, the president's ability to make treaties. But then the president has a number of informal powers, including the bully pulpit, the idea that he can speak, he can tweet, and he can try to shape public opinion. And in some ways, executive orders, the presidential orders to the executive branch, are an example of those informal powers. So great questions.
Say, is there anything we need to know about the vice president? I would say yes. The vice president is often chosen to balance the presidential ticket. So when Donald Trump was running for office, and some said, listen, the old guy doesn't have much experience. Pick somebody a little bit younger with a lot of political experience. We found Mike Pence. Balance the ticket. Barack Obama did the same thing with Joe Biden. But also remember, and this is hard to remember this, but it will be on tomorrow's test. The vice president is the presiding officer of the U.S. Senate. The president of the Senate, president, is the vice president. But what power does the presiding officer have of the U.S. Senate? Start it at the beginning of the session and break all voting ties. Other than that, none. So Mike Pence doesn't spend too much time in the U.S. Senate.
Hey, a shout out. He's never gotten a shout out. Mr. Falk gets his shout out. So thank you, Mike, for that shout out.
Watch it.
And Sam Feldman, thank you for joining Twitter, and thank you for your shout out to Mr. Elbaum.
Great,
lovely,
great.
And a shout out to Mr. Kaplan from Sandra, and she wants to know the difference between the cabinet and the White House office. I love this question.
I love this.
So this is the idea that the president has a cabinet. Those are the big names: Secretary of State, Department of Treasury. And it seems like they have a lot of power, but really the president, for his day-to-day advice, goes to the White House staff. That White House staff, like the National Security Advisor, like the Chief of Staff, like the Director of the Budget, the Office of Management and Budget, those are the advisors that the president will listen to on a daily basis for advice on how to run the government. So the White House staff in many cases has more power because they're giving the president advice on a daily basis. Remember, the White House staff, traditionally very, very loyal to the president. Many of them were actually on his campaign team, no matter whether it's President Trump or President Obama. That White House staff, very loyal to the president, whereas the cabinet secretaries, they have mixed loyalties because, yeah, they want to give the president good advice, but they also have to manage their big departments and agencies.
Hey, behind us, you see a map of the Electoral College. Remember, the Electoral College is the indirect means by which we select our president. 538 total electors determined by population plus 2, right? You take your number of members in the House in each state and add your 2 senators. That's your total number of electors. And it's winner take all. 538 electors, and it takes a simple majority to become president. That's 270. You'll be asked that, but you'll also be asked, what happens if no one receives a majority in the Electoral College? Who picks our president? It's the House of Representatives. For those of you who are curious, how do they vote in the House? Each state gets 1 vote.
We have 9 minutes left in this annual broadcast on Citizen Youth. Thank you so much. If we don't get to your question, we really appreciate you tuning in. We know you're going to do great. Go to our website, citizenu.org. We have a lot of helpful tips on there. Clara wants to give a shout out to Mrs. Beverly's 5th period. Just give us some basics, Dan, on the differences between liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans.
Well, this is, of course, what we call political ideology. That these are shortcuts that we use. How do we group voters together? We give them labels. Labels such as liberal, labels such as conservative. Groups to align with, such as Democrats, groups to align with, such as Republicans. What does this mean? Here's it in a nutshell. Liberals are interested in trying new things. They tend to be younger. New things, Democratic Party. Let's experiment with new policies. Conservatives tend to look back, whereas liberals look forward. Conservatives tend to look back. Remember the good old days. Life was so much better in the 50s. So these tend to be older, and these are Republicans. But here's the difference. You say, well, don't we have a lot of young people? How come Democrats don't win all the elections? Young people vote at the lowest rates. The older people vote at the highest rates. So even one could argue if every American citizen voted, Democrats should win every election. Problem is not everyone votes. In fact, majorities don't. Republicans win as voter turnouts decline. Conservatives, Republicans look back. Let's hold on to their traditions. This is why white men tend to be more likely to be Republicans and conservative. Women and young people tend to be more likely liberal because it's, hey, I'm tired of being treated unfairly. Move forward. Liberals, conservatives, Democrats, and Republicans.
Yarath, a shout out to Ms. Prochaska,
yes.
And wants to know about the differences between the different courts. So in the federal court system,
great question.
We have a Supreme Court at the top of the federal court system. At the bottom of the federal court system are what we call district courts. They have trials, or what we call original jurisdiction. And then in between, we have the Circuit Court of Appeals. So appellate jurisdiction means that the Court of Appeals and the circuits, they're allowed to review the decisions of those trial courts. And of course, we have a dual court system in the United States,
Federalist,
because most of the cases that are actually in the court system are in the state and local courts. And so the Supreme Court, which hears about 80 cases a year, has 10,000 cases appealed to it every year. but most of those cases are from the state courts.
Hey, how about a plea bargain? Do you know what a plea bargain is? The vast majority of all law cases in our country are settled in a plea bargain. They don't even go to trial, even though you have a civil liberty to a trial. They negotiate some sort of lesser sentence, lesser admission of guilt for a lower period of time in prison or a smaller penalty. We call this a plea bargain. It is not constitutionally protected.
Tasia, thank you for the shout out. Brandon Yang, thank you for the shout out to Mrs. Schiller. Jesse, a great shout out to Mrs. Ashmore's third period class from LaGrange, Georgia. And she asked, I think it's a good question, about libel. And this is the idea that there are some times when the government can punish journalists or the media for expressing falsehoods. Libel is written falsehoods that's printed with a malicious intent. And there was a famous Supreme Court case, New York Times versus Sullivan, where the New York Times was protected from a libel lawsuit because the courts have said, listen, we want to make it very difficult to sue newspapers for libel. Otherwise, newspapers are going to really go out of business. We also have a law about governmental transparency, which protects the First Amendment, and that's called FOIA, or the Freedom of Information Act, which gives citizens and journalists the right to request information from the executive branch. Now, the executive branch of the president doesn't always have to hand that over, particularly if that information is going to harm national security. And remember that case of Nixon versus U.S., which was about executive privilege, where President Nixon did not want to hand over the Watergate tapes.
I am not a crook.
But in that case, the Supreme Court said that the president's executive privilege was not absolute, and that Nixon had to hand over those tapes. We have 4 minutes.
Hey, Andy, we're almost done. We haven't said this, and make sure you listen carefully. On the FRQs tomorrow, we think there'll be a data set, some sort of chart, maybe a graph, maybe a pie chart to look at. Please, please, please read the title. When you write about the trend in that chart or in that graph, oftentimes you just get to, if you rewrite the title, you're in good shape. Read everything in that data set, but look for an anticipated data set, read it carefully, write about it carefully, be explicit, don't use pronouns. Make sure you say things like percentages as opposed to just making broad statements. Literally write out what the chart says.
Hannah, shout out to Mrs. Brush at Hampshire High. Hannah, a conference committee is a joint committee because members of the House and the Senate are both on that conference committee. And the conference committee's job is to reconcile the differences, to make sure that the House and the Senate are passing identical legislation. And Samantha has a shout out to Mrs. Pizzola. One of your favorite topics, Dan, devolution. We have 3 minutes, so keep it short.
Devolution simply means it's a conservative idea because it's returning power to the state government. So the national government is returning power that the state governments once had. Again, clearly conservative, going back to the way it once was.
Shout out to Coach Bowler. And this has been a number of questions asking about political polarization.
Great question.
And recent voter trends. Well, that is the voter trend of political polarization, where we know that because of primary elections, we know that Democrats are becoming more liberal, Republicans are becoming more conservative.
No compromise.
And that many, many voters are actually de-aligning from political parties, where more and more voters are saying, hey, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm independent. Now, the reality is when voters go to vote in a presidential election, party is still a huge indicator of how they vote. And while we're on the topic of political socialization in the United States,
very good.
Family is the #1 indicator of political socialization.
Andy, I'm shuffling our most important words that we study in our class. I'm going to pick one card out, and that card is going to be the essential topic for tomorrow's test. I feel lucky. Platforms. There's going to be opportunities tomorrow to talk about the differences of the political parties. What do they stand for? Are political parties strong or weak? Do issues matter, or is it more about personality? Candidate-centered campaigns. I think tomorrow you'll have a chance to talk and write about political parties, Republicans, Democrats, stronger, weaker, how they are involved in the campaigns, how political parties are involved in governing. Majorities run the Congress. Woo! Platforms.
Hey, our last shout outs of the night. We have one more minute.
Shout out to Miss Stone and Miss Fenton. Boy, have you done a great job.
Terrific. Mr. Russum's 6th hour AP at Menasha High. Mrs. Schiller, we have a shout out to. We have a shout out to Mrs. Chase. Oh, many of your students on here, Mrs. Chase. Thank you so much. And we want to thank you for tuning in to another year of Cram for the Exam on citizenu.org. We appreciate your support. Thanks for all those tweeted questions. You guys are going to do great tomorrow. Get a good night's sleep and best wishes.
Remember, we're the two teachers. No fancy words.
No fancy suits.
Plain talk about issues you need to know.
Just in time.
Good night, everybody. Best of luck. Remember, it's not a class. It's a lifestyle.